So, hello everybody. Welcome to our event, Ensuring Gender-Sensitive Reparations Through Women's Leadership, which highlights the work and views of the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy, which I'm here representing today, WFM-IGP, more practically speaking, as well as our partner organizations, Corporación Humanas in Colombia and Misone in Mali. So to lead this conversation, we have here with us today the legal director of Corporación Humanas, Viviana Rodríguez Peña, and we hopefully will have with us shortly also the president of Misone, Mama Koité Doumbia. And I am Jessica Boulet. I'm the Human Rights and Gender Specialist for WFM-IGP. And we're also very excited to have here today Elisabeth Lothe, who is here on behalf of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Norway is supporting today's event and has supported the work and joint collaboration of Humanas, Misone, and WFM-IGP in relation to women, peace, and security over the past 3 years. For Elisabeth Lothe is a senior advisor in the section for peace and reconciliation in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she's worked on peacemaking, peace building, and peacekeeping for around a decade. Before she joined the MFA, she worked with the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations in New York, Timor-Leste and South Sudan, and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Asia. And her field of expertise is justice and security sector reform, dialogue, inclusion of civil society, and women, peace, and security. So I'll let her, she has kindly agreed to provide some opening remarks. So I'll hand it over to you, Elisabeth.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Jessica, and thanks for allowing me to address this very important and interesting event here today. We are very excited to have been able to support the project and specifically the work in Mali and in Colombia for some years now. It's a very concrete example of the importance that Norway gives to the need for gender perspectives in transitional justice processes and the work around retributions. We find it very interesting, this model where you have strong partners and you're able to bring the experience from the ground, from this very innovative and good work also to the global level. Mali and Colombia happens to be priority countries for us in our 1325 strategy, as described in our national action plan. So the work is therefore of great interest in Norway, in our ministry as well. So we're very grateful to have an opportunity to engage closely with all of you. As you know, Norway has also been the facilitator, the co-facilitator of the process, the peace process in Colombia. And throughout, we have emphasized the need for transitional justice to be strong. And we keep emphasizing the need for implementing, of course, the agreement, but the system of transitional justice mechanisms that have been agreed now also after the agreement has been signed. We have worked very hard as facilitator to ensure that the needs and priorities and rights of victims are reflected throughout. Before I finish, I would like to again emphasize that the work that the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy is doing in bridging the country experience to the global level, the coalition building, the advocacy you do, combined with these very concrete interventions, it's a very potent one as we see it. We believe you open spaces for women and civil society, you help develop capacities, and really have an impact both at the local, national, and international governing bodies and actors that are relevant for taking the gender perspectives into account. Whether we talk about legislators, government officials, security services, national institutions, but you're also doing a great job at lifting this discussion to the global level. As you know, we're currently a member of the UN Security Council, and we greatly value the input we get from this work, and we will really strive to bring it with us as we work on mandates and resolutions and presidential statements, because this is what has an impact on the ground eventually. Yes, I would just like to thank you for inviting me, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to the experience and perspectives that will come out in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for those very kind words. And we are very excited to be working with Norway, certainly, in this project and hopefully in future. So before we launch into our conversation, I want to highlight to everyone, as those of you who have been with us for past events already know, this discussion is a continuation of previous conversations about women, peace, and security, and specifically about reparations that Humanas and Musone and WFM-IGP have had over the course of our project together. And at our most recent event in December, Mama and Viviana highlighted the need for reparations that are truly restorative and victim-centered, meaning that they center the voice of survivors, recognize and address the full range of harm suffered, and seek to transform the underlying systems of inequality that led to disproportionate harm against certain groups. Some common threads emerged in that conversation. In both Colombia and Mali, we heard how when women are disenfranchised, overlooked, or treated as mere victims or service recipients by government, and where patriarchal social norms aim to undermine women's views of themselves, it is critical for women to understand and have recognized their rights and their inherent dignity, for which reparations plays an essential part. These reparations might include monetary compensation, as well as symbolic measures and societal reforms that work to prevent the recurrence of gender-based rights violations in the future. In Mali, we heard about the need to overcome social and certain religious narratives, as well as the challenges of working in a multilingual environment, and a very multilingual environment. And in Colombia, Viviana outlined the challenges facing communities that are disenfranchised on multiple axes, including on the basis of race and due to poverty. Across the board, women deal with social stigma and a history of neglect or outright hostility from their governments, and they also face difficulties in accessing mechanisms for justice. Overarchingly, some of the biggest challenges we heard about relate to political will. The need to go beyond mere words, spoken or on paper, and actually implement change. On a more inspiring note, we also heard about the strong leadership that survivors of sexual and gender-based violence continue to demonstrate within their communities as they learned more about their rights to justice, to compensation, to dignity, and to equality. And we also touched on the many frustrations and social, legal, and economic barriers to women, preventing them from obtaining holistic reparations or making that more difficult. So today's event will pick up that discussion, and we'll seek to dig a little deeper and also to highlight this year's CSW theme, which is women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls.
Now I'm going to introduce, it is my pleasure to introduce Viviana. Viviana is a lawyer specializing in human rights and studying for a master's degree in public affairs, specializing in accompanying victims of human rights violations and communities with a differentiating and gender-based approach. She has participated in programs to bring access to justice to victims, where they focus on gender, human rights defenders, collective reparation, and political and social leadership by women. She is currently the coordinator of the legal department at Corporación Humanas in Colombia. So welcome, Viviana, and thank you. If I may start with a question. Viviana, can you give us a general description on how the current transitional justice schemes in Colombia are tackling reparations regarding gender issues, and what opportunities have survivors to participate in social and public life or leading these processes? Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for having me here. Thank you for allowing me to continue this dialogue and hearing the inputs from Mali. And thank you to the World Federalist Movement for its support, and thank you to NORAD for their support as well. First of all, I would like to talk about the process we are working on right now, which is the implementation of the peace agreements in Colombia, which is the most recent. It is not the only peace process we've had in our history. And what we try is to seek for truth of our conflict, of the roots of our conflict, and bring integral reparations. What we have established in this peace agreement was restorative justice that seeks to repair the damage that people have suffered throughout this armed conflict and the actions of the armed groups, and reparation of the victims, especially those that have suffered by standing in the front line and working to end the decades of violence. Also, obviously, the violence that women have suffered on the basis of their gender throughout this armed conflict. So in this presentation, I would like to talk about the connection that exists between truth and reparation. Even though in Colombia we have administrative restoration, we have legal restoration and reparation, but when these processes go through the ordinary justice schemes, but we also are aiming at providing reparations for victims at the end of transitional justice processes. In this moment, we are at the initial stages where we are listening to witnesses or members of the armed conflict that we unfortunately continue to live through, and we are also hearing from the victims. And this is a process whereby legal truths can contribute to recognize sexual-based violence and contribute towards a life free of violence for women. The Corporación Humanas accompanies victims of sexual-based violence in 3 regions of Colombia, and we represent 20 women in one of these cases that are before the Transitional Justice Courts. Our objectives through this work is to eradicate violence against women, especially sexual violence, and that the peace agreement is implemented and brings the whole truth of what happened to women so that these victims may start on the journey of an integral reparation. During this transitional justice process, we have identified the challenges for this legal truth to become part of reparation for sexual-based violence victims, and helps other victims that for a myriad of reasons have not come forward, have not talked about what happened to them, and also the right that society in general has to know the truth of what happened. In this sense, transitional justice in Colombia is, or one of the entities that is currently exercising this transitional justice scheme is the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. Its acronym in Spanish is the JEP, or the HEP. The HEP, or the GEP, is listening to 7 cases right now, and they are trying to bring light to some crimes, others issues involving the territories and displacement. And what is worthy to note here is that gender-based violence and sexual-based violence is also part of all 7 cases. But so far, there is not one case where we have been able to concentrate all gender-based victims and all gender-based violence, and this is a petition that we are still trying to push forward, and I'm going to explain why. We believe that this way of investigating gender-based violence throughout the Colombian territories and its associated crimes is worrying to us, because we wonder what it is, what capacity it has to reflect what really happened to women, to recognize the damage that they suffered, and that the perpetrators recognize that they committed these acts, and therefore they move towards integral reparation. This worry that we have reflects the fact that gender-based violence, and including LGBTI community and also members of the armed forces, has an underlying gender tone, and this implies challenges for the justice schemes and the achievement of truth. I wanted to highlight 4 of these challenges. We are not going to be able to talk about all of them in detail, but they will provide a frame for the work that we are doing. The first challenge is to listen to women and members of the LGBTI community which were victims of the armed conflict and guarantee that they may participate in all stages of the process. The second challenge is to recognize that committing these crimes is associated to gender, and that gender-based violence has differentiating damages. Another challenge is to recognize and to demand that the armed groups that were responsible for these crimes make themselves responsible for it. They are held accountable, but this has to do with social, political, economic agendas that justify or naturalize sexual violence. And the final challenge is to recognize the differentiating impact or damage that sexual-based violence victims suffer, and connect it to a more collective reparation process that may come at the end of this transitional justice scheme. In this sense, I would just like to highlight 2 of these points. The first is that if we are right now talking about sexual violence, if we discuss it today in Colombia or in Mali or other countries, it is because victims of sexual violence have covered a long journey to make themselves heard. And this is the starting point that transitional and ordinary justice schemes have to look for truth and reparation. In Colombia, before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, or JEP, women can participate by providing accounts of what happened to them. We consider that this is an active participation and a contribution towards truth that our country needs. First of all, because taking into account the nature of sexual-based violence and their impact, being able to present an account of what happened to them breaks the silence and the self-blame and guilt that victims have. And second, these accounts or reports are processes of individual or collective efforts, some by a psychosocial accompaniment, that have allowed women to talk about their truth as women. And we are also talking about the truth about African Colombian women. And these accounts are put to the service of the transitional justice process. For us, these informs or accounts are an action that deserves an answer. And this is why we see the need for the Special Jurisdiction for Peace to materialize the gender-based approach into concrete actions. To give you some examples, we talk about the under-registry of sexual violence cases against women, and how these cases end up being, let's call it, a reason for the ordinary justice schemes to call it isolated cases or cases that are not tied to the armed conflict. In Colombia, the Constitutional Court, the High Court, has already recognized since 2008 that sexual violence was a systematic, habitual practice in the Colombian armed conflict. But today, now we need to guarantee that this sexual-based violence is described in these terms, is not described in these terms as isolated and not connected to the armed conflict, which is tied to opportunistic sexual violence that denies gender-based discrimination on the one hand and denies the use of sexual violence as an instrument of war. This under-registry exists in most countries that see a lot of sexual-based violence. So the question is, what can transitional justice schemes do for this not becoming the main barrier that women encounter, and so that the building of truth as part of reparation recognizes and reaffirms to the world, in our case Colombia, that sexual violence exists. It happened, many were its victims, and it became a systematic practice in our country, and that there are perpetrators that need to own up to these actions and explain why they did it. We found that a dialogue on sexual violence in transitional justice as a dialogue that brings reparative effects for victims needs that we change the way we talk about sexual violence. And here, specifically, we are demanding or proposing that the special jurisdiction for peace, but in general, the justice schemes around the world, changes the way we talk about this violence against women. Basically, what we want is, first of all, there's a first phase where members of the armed groups deny the use of sexual violence. But we have many accounts of women from which we can deduce its use as an instrument of war in the armed conflict. And this is why we say that justice schemes is not the place to reinforce the idea that sexual violence was not connected to the war, and that these crimes should be silenced and forgotten. We need this dialogue to put the spotlight on women and hear them out. It is their accounts that need to be at the center of the justice processes. And what we expect from armed group members that appear before the court is that they recognize their part in it and contribute to the construction of the truth of the armed conflict. We believe that a discussion in this way can influence, first of all, how women feel recognized, and that their truth will contribute to a collective truth. But also, since it is the starting point, it is a starting point for members of the armed groups to recognize their responsibility in this. We believe that transitional justice in Colombia has the function of complementing what the ordinary justice schemes have not been able to do regarding the armed conflict. And this is why part of the peace agreement is to forego punishment in favor of their truth that these women and society needs. When the members of the armed groups accept their responsibility, we need a change, we need a transformation on how we tackle sexual violence. And this can bring about a change in our society regarding sexual violence and how we describe it and how we think about it. We need these armed groups to recognize that they committed sexual violence of their own volition, that they stop talking about these uncontrollable sexual urges that brings about this opportunistic sexual violence, and they explain to us why sexual violence was a weapon used to dominate, to control, to chastise, and torture of many women, and other women and other people that were also victims of sexual violence. We need that these groups recognize responsibility, but also institutions in our society that hold power over women's bodies. We need reparation through truth, a reparation that transforms the voices of these victims into a recognition of truth, the truth of what happened in the armed conflict, that may bring us closer to our need of a true and sustainable peace as the peace agreements state, and that really contributes towards social change in Colombia, where we can recognize that women are vulnerable to sexual violence, and that as a society we can commit ourselves to prevent violence against women within and without the armed conflict. These are our main reflections that we bring to the peace process, and as a starting point for reparation. What we want is a national debate that is centered around sexual violence and reproductive health violence and other types of gender-based violence, that allows us to analyze, together with the judges and victims and perpetrators, as an integral process that is aimed at repairing society as a whole. So that was my intervention for now. Thank you. Thank you, Viviana. I have a question for you. Even though the Special Jurisdiction for Peace is investigating numerous crimes against women, in your remarks you said that they are not applying systematically a gender-based approach in these cases. Can you explain a bit more the importance of the difference between adopting a gender-based approach in justice processes and in reparations, compared to simply investigating crimes committed against women? We think that one possibility is investigating sexual-based violence in several territories and tying it to specific crimes. But in this way of investigation, we lose the gender-based approach, because in the different territories we saw many types of violence, and the dialogue is that gender-based violence is not as important. We need to understand that these facts are few, they're isolated. This is a way of investigating that may have a gender-based approach, but it has not been able to tackle these challenges through specific measures. Our proposal is that we need to investigate throughout all the territories where gender-based violence occurred, and we list all of the armed groups that perpetrated this violence and catalog the victims and how it was used as an instrument of war, which will allow us to overcome this challenge of the invisibility of the victims. What we find is that reparation that victims start to have right now is tied to the building of truth, because sexual-based violence is taken as a minor crime, an unrelated crime. And what we are finding now is that women talk about their victimization, but their accounts are not reflected in the actions of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. Recently, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace heard about the use of kidnapping as an instrument of war. And in this decision of gathering these accounts, it encountered 36 accounts of gender-based violence. Our criticism of this is that they had 36 cases of accounts of sexual-based violence during their kidnapping, which could have been used to open up this kind of violence, but this violence was not talked about. It was mentioned, which was an advance. We believe that we need to do more. Women have already come forward. They have brought us to where we are politically and socially, recognizing sexual violence, and what they deserve as an answer is a characterization of what happened, how it was used. Why is sexual violence used as punishment during their captivity? What it is to go through sexual-based violence during a long period of captivity, as we saw for many victims, especially in the 90s and the end of the century, the last century. We believe that the opportunity is there, but taking a gender-based approach demands much more concrete actions and transformative actions. This is why we propose a national dialogue. There may be other ways, but at least right now we are worried that the truth at the center of transitional justice does not repair victims of sexual-based violence. In your comments, you also talked about the central role of using truth as a way towards reparation for survivors of sexual-based violence and gender-based violence, which is of great importance. We need to recognize their stories and the suffering of these victims. However, at the same time, the processes and legal and judicial investigations are inherently combative and may re-traumatize these victims, these survivors, because the legal process uses testimony of the victims and they are placed in a very vulnerable position. Can women prosecutors improve this situation? Are there other strategies that we can imagine to improve these dynamics? I think that there are women that, once knowing the risks of appearing in a legal process, well, they go through this process because justice makes sense for them. And this is a fundamental point. If justice makes sense for victims, so what we have to do is accompany them and overcome these barriers that we've talked about today, the barriers of women in accessing justice. In transitional justice schemes, we say that it is centered on victims, but we always question what this means. How do we move it from paper into reality? And one of the ways is to believe them from the onset and not try to limit the opportunities where we question women on their accounts. I think that this transitional justice scheme that we have in Colombia right now does not have a space like other processes have to change the focus of the investigation not towards the perpetrator but towards the victim. The perpetrator has to talk about his responsibility, but we need another step forward, which is to take measures to not allow discourses that justify sexual violence or that minimizes it and treat it as a minor issue, as the spoils of war. And in this sense, there is a very important role to play for victims of sexual-based violence that have assumed a very important leadership, talking to the media, talking to society, and that they have the possibility to speaking before judges, because they are the voice of many other women that have not traveled this journey into leadership, but also need judges to hear them out. I think that organizations need to play a leading role in translating this legal world into possibilities for sexual-based violence to be visible and understand what reparations need to be done. And I also believe that there are different positions among the judges throughout the transitional justice scheme that are betting on this gender-based approach. But there's also resistance. Sometimes talking about women's rights is a discourse that is accepted at the political level, is politically correct, but we're unable to translate it into concrete actions. One of these is to demand of the perpetrators that they talk about their roles. We are at a point, not if sexual-based violence occurred or not. We know that it occurred. So we cannot allow a discourse that questions victims, that signals them as liars or tries to shift the blame on them, we need to go through this process. I wouldn't want to burden women prosecutors or women judges with this burden that it is only women that are in charge of implementing a gender-based approach, although they may play a very important role. We insist that it is the whole justice apparatus, independent of gender, that is mandated to apply this gender-based approach. I think that there is the political will, but we need to move from discourse into actions, into materializing. One of the ways that we propose that this is done is through this national dialogue, which allows us to understand the dimension of sexual-based violence in Colombia, and it will allow us, victims and our organizations, to contribute towards how sexual-based violence is investigated, how we bring visibility to the victims and to the perpetrators, and bet on a more ample restoration in society. Unfortunately, we are seeing the armed conflict come back, and this armed conflict brings back the risk of sexual-based violence against women. Thank you, Viviana. You also mentioned in your comments the use of sexual violence not only against women, but also the LGBT community and men as a means of control and domination. How do gender-sensitive approaches are applied to these different groups? And how do these take into account the whole gender spectrum in thinking about ways of preventing the recurrence of gender-based violence? Here, the bet that several organizations are making is that a national discussion will allow us to discuss all of these variants. But even if we continue under the modality that we are on when we investigate sexual-based violence associated to territories and other crimes, we find that there is a need to, first of all, recognize the victims. This is the first question that organizations make themselves when they accompany members of the LGBT community is, where are these LGBTI victims? So that we can adequately characterize sexual violence. It involves understanding if there is a discrimination based on sexual identity, so that this is not silenced. We can't talk about victims as if they are all alike, and denying that there are some groups that are more vulnerable and that discrimination against these was a determining factor in this sexual-based violence. There's another issue, is that these groups not only suffer sexual-based violence, but other types of crimes aimed at punishing them for breaking the gender rules. And this is also difficult to talk about. This discrimination is something that we need to recognize as a society, but it is difficult to talk about the fact that we belong to such a society. We also have accounts of sexual violence against men, and needs to be included in seeking for truth. We need to talk about why this was used, because many of these aggressions have to do with putting down men into the same position as women have in society, where we discriminate against them and humiliate them and mistreat them and torture them. But the important thing is that this becomes visible and that we recognize that these patterns occur. We break the silence, because this does not only occur within the framework of the armed conflict, this occurs in daily life. And the transformation that we need in Colombia has to go beyond signaling some victims, and it needs to move towards, there are things that we need to change as a society if we want to really guarantee the rights of people independent of their gender and their sexual identity or sexual orientation. In terms of reparation, it is also very important to start there. We need to mention them, recognize that they exist, recognize that there is a motive behind these crimes that has its roots in discrimination. And maybe later on, because this process in the special jurisdiction for peace is in its initial stages, but later on we can think about how collective measures that are going to be approved as sanctions may contribute towards reparation of these victims, which some are organized in groups or collectives and some are not. The idea is that they are all represented in the reparations that the armed groups are subject to. Well, thank you so much for your explanation. And now, finally and quickly also, because we want to have time to listen to Mama Koité, but the Women's Peace and Security Agenda has been scrutinized since the beginning because it did not adopt a human rights-based approach and for framing women and girls mainly as victims. But some observers feel that Resolution 2467 of 2019 established a more holistic approach to reparations and also investigating sexual-based violence on men and boys. In your opinion, has this resolution improved the efficacy of the agenda to promote effective reparations? If not, what else do we need to do? I need that the agenda has had to listen to women and recognize not only that they are a victim, but that they also have proposal that they are leaders in this process, and that they are also part of peacemaking in our territories. In Colombia, it has been a process to recognize women as peace builders. Today, women have acquired a much more political dimension, and women's leadership has become very prevalent in many countries around the world, including Colombia. However, I feel that reparations continue to be an issue that is constantly reaffirmed, but it hasn't achieved a much more concrete definition. I don't know what is happening in Mali, but right now many of the states are questioning if they have enough budget for these reparations. And in sexual violence, clearly the reparations that are needed and would be adequate imply having a budget for these processes, including health-related processes. And this is where I feel that, or I perceive that it is okay to talk about reparations and talk about integral reparations, but states are still resistant of having a budget for this purpose. For example, Colombia is still investing more in war than in reparation for victims. We have agendas that do not facilitate this investment. We have the fight against drug trafficking that brings about a lot of violence for our territories. So I think that the agenda takes the shape of women's, according to women's demands, but we need to continue to push governments for a serious monitoring of the measures that are really aimed at gender-based reparations. And the question that we are always asking in our organizations is moving beyond the discourse and what is the concrete financing? Where is it that shows the political will of recognizing what happened to women and transforming our reality? The question is, what is the investment that we are what is the amount of money that we're investing in victims' health? And this is something whereby we could measure the political will of the state in concrete terms. Excellent. And I think that this is a very good point that we could discuss with Mama Koité right now about what is going on in Mali. And then we can circle back to this question of women, peace, and security. But first of all, I'm going to switch languages into French for the interpreters and for the audience. Mama has been fighting for 30 years for African women's rights to peace. She is the president of Musone in Mali. She is a member of the UN's consultative body for Africa. She is Vice President of the European Union. She received in 2011 an award, and in 2005 she was up for the Nobel Peace Prize. So, Mama Koité, I'm going to open up the floor by asking you a question. I would like to concentrate on some of the current measures that have been implemented in your country from the gender-based approach, individual, collective, and symbolic reparations, because in Mali this year you started to administrate these types of projects and are being examined and debated by the government of Mali for victims' reparations. Precisely the measures that are being taken in favor of these victims and how they can benefit from medical treatment and economic readaptation, and to develop skills to reintegrate into society. Mama Koité, you have been very active in this work. How have these programs succeeded in repairing the victims, and what are the challenges? Thank you very much, Jessica. I apologize because I had technical problems because my assistant is sick, but I hope that you can hear me just fine right now. Thank you for the question. I wanted to thank all women and all persons involved in organizing this event, and now focus on the problem of repairing victims of sexual-based violence. As you have heard, the conflict since 2012 has really been centered around women, because women have been dilapidated and displaced. Mali ratified many programs and committed itself to a program of assistance and reparation to victims. In the case of the International Criminal Court, it ordered executing $2.7 million to repair victims of the destruction of these documents, of these monuments in Mali. So we needed to first identify the victims and hear their accounts. And starting January of 2021, we have started to make reparations. And as of today, we have gone through 128 individual reparations. We are working on parity. The beneficiaries of these reparations have to come as equals so that we have more validity in this process, and this is also important for society in general, how victims, which are the center of the conflict, are seen and treated. And what I feel is that it was important for the rehabilitation programs, we had to center them around the victims, because today we are in Mali trying to go through individual reparations by providing a monetary compensation. Because, as I said, we have reparated 128 women and 10 men. because women were in a very regrettable position, actually. And this is why it was necessary to go through these reparations. These women have an intermediate age level, and we had to establish this program, having them at the center of it. And the latest efforts to ratify our treaties, we are well aware that at the heart of this process, we have to place the victims of sexual violence. So the government created the National Commission, with which we have been working with, so that they take women into account, their claims in their accounts, because victims in general do not want to talk about their accounts before in the presence of men. So we had to bring in a lot of women to help these women in providing their testimony. And this is something that the Commission needs to continue to work on, because they had to translate all into digital data, and then this work was not done for economic reasons. And another important fact, which is a big issue, is that they included victims from 1960, and this brings the total number to an enormous amount. And today, since many decades have gone by, the justice system in Mali is demanding what happened in those cases after so many decades. So that is impossible. It's not that we want to exclude these people, but gathering evidence is absolutely impossible to prove if a woman was raped or not 50 years ago, 60 years ago. We have also heard many petitions, many voices that say, well, for what is a transitional justice scheme? What is it for? So we saw a surge of victims coming forward, wanting to be recognized as such. So sometimes it's better for us to go to where they live to gather their testimony at the local level, hear them out. But the problem is the language barrier and a physical space barrier, because they are in their communities, and speaking before their communities is many times a very sensitive issue. We know that these women are very poor and they can't travel long distances to provide a testimony, so there is a contradiction there. Nevertheless, the government's policy is that it's better for us to move and go to them and try and see how we can help them out, because what is going to happen when these women have to travel to the capital to provide their testimony? This demands financial resources, logistics efforts, and we have to look for better mechanisms. There is some budget that is going to be destined to women and for reparation. Some women were raped and lapidated, and we are going to start a program in about 3 months to accompany these victims. And for this, we had financial help from our sponsors, like the government of Canada, that is interested in Mali's victims of sexual-based violence. And we expect that most of this international aid that we get is destined is used to repair women. We need these women to feel whole and feel repaired. So this is why in Mali we created a center called UMA. And this is a place where women may feel accompanied and sheltered and protected. We have had the input from many volunteers and NGOs to create this center, also to create rehabilitation centers because there is much to heal. The conflict was very dramatic in our country. Many women continued being raped. And they live in the most abject poverty imaginable. They don't even have the means to survive on a day-to-day basis. So we need to hear her testimony, but if she doesn't have enough to eat, when we first have to feed her, and once she has her material needs taken care of, she can move on to a different level and worry about how to gather her testimony. The biggest action that we can do is to create a women's platform in Mali to help women contribute towards peace, but also for justice and reparation. For us, this platform for mutual help between women is very important. I just came back from Gao 5 days ago. I was there getting training by NORAD to talk about reparations, peace, and identify other needs derived from the armed conflict. And other needs came up, not only the ones arising from the old conflict, but now the new conflict. And only the government can help us in this. Another important factor is dignity, to protect these women's dignity, and for this we need to establish programs that can help these women leaving this physical and emotional suffering, because these women will not be able to abandon their communities, which is the spaces where they have suffered. So this is another important work that needs to be done. Many things that we need to think about. And understand that the conflict is not over, that women are raped and lapidated every day, that need help, that need protection, accompaniment. And also we have the issue that not all women are open to talking about what happened to them. This is a very difficult process. Silence is prevalent in many communities. So we need concrete actions. So women feel where the help is coming from. In Mali, the bills before Congress, all of this is there, it's ready, but we have only seen religious leaders. And you know that these religious leaders are totally patriarchal. And so where is the women's voices? There are a lot of taboos in our culture regarding homosexuality, for example. There are many things that are silenced, many topics that are silenced, and are used to manipulate people from a religious standpoint. And this makes the fight for women's rights much harder. It is very difficult to talk about this openly in a society such as ours. We have legislators that do not want to even hear about any discussion on this topic. And sometimes we have to call these big legislators and call them up and, why can't your wife participate in this process so that she can be heard? well, it's very interesting to hear about what is being done in Mali and the challenges that lie ahead. But for you as president, of the Victims Fund, what are these reparations that you want for women, and how can women participate and lead, and how can we stop marginalizing women? Because yes, Jessica, the most important part is women's participation in the legislative process. The conflict is not over, but so we said we need a peace agreement that takes women's perspective into account, and this has to be an independent point. It has to be able to evaluate and investigate crimes committed against women and sexual violence to be taken as a crime, but this needs to be an independent entity. We explained this. But there's still a lot of work to be done. So we need the help of the United Nations, because there are many, many testimonies in Mali, and these women want to get training to understand how they can exercise their rights. And the second issue is that the government has created a commission to listen to these victims, but no women were part of this commission. And the UN's groups in Mali also pointed this out. Finally, they relented and they put 9 women on the commission, including myself. But this is not the only mechanism. There are others. For example, we have the leaving of arms and reintegration. And in these commissions, no women are part of them neither. We have one commission that has 1 woman on it, and the other do not. They announced that they are going to onboard 12 women, but we have many difficulties for our voice to be heard. Because there's also the humanitarian issue. We want to do something, but there are many state-related issues that do not allow it. We are not listened to easily. There is a lot of work to be done. We need to create awareness. We need to move petitions. You cannot imagine the amount of work that we have before us, and the dimension that this requires from the point of view of integrating women. And we need support at all levels. First of all, to train women in the field and in the cities, in rural areas and the cities. We need electoral reform. We need a large number of legislative reforms. And this work is not done in a day. And we need to include women in this work. We need to travel to conflict areas and place these victims as the center of the process. Because if they are not at the center of the process, they will not be visible. And there will be a struggle for visibility and for who are the true victims. We need to continue to advocate for women's rights. Thank God NORD has helped us a lot in this. It has given us many opportunities for training. And we are now working with women that have come from the refugee camps. These women came forward to make themselves be seen and heard and say, we exist, and we are part of Mali, and we are here. So we were able to give them this opportunity. And it is important for these true victims to be made visible. And these women were able to cry and share and come back home stronger. There are many questions still to be answered. So we need to create new scenarios to hear them out. And we also were made aware of other dimensions, other realities, and we understand now that we need to bring groups into these cities to provide relief and support. And that there's a lot of work to be done to integrate women at all levels. We have a law now that want to bring up women's participation to a minimum threshold of 35%. And at the political level, this is okay. And it is important. In Gao, the authorities had a lot of work. But what we were able to see was that in Gao, there was only men in the commissions, and that can't be if women are not a part. If they are not heard and they don't bring their perspective, it is very difficult to get something done. I see that we are out of time. In 2 minutes, I'm going to have to cut short our event. But before, I wanted to ask you the question on the evolution of the agenda in terms of restoration, and also regarding Law 2457, if this resolution has made the women's agenda more visible and has it promoted reparations? If not, what needs to be done? Yes, Jessica. We also have a women activist as myself in Musonet, and she knows well the work that we have done and needs to be done, and she has also been in New York with me to take women's position into account. And for her, this rehabilitation center is very important, where we provide accompaniment to women. And the first act that this woman did was through the Prime Minister of Mali, a national action plan was adopted for the fight against gender-based violence. And this politician committed himself to this project. And this is how we integrated this new dimension of rehabilitating victims. Yesterday, I talked to this woman, and we will hold a ceremony here in Mali. And we will have awareness creating activities on gender and sexual violence issues. And we are going to invite society and public entities. But what is the political support that we are going to have here? What is the commitment? That is the question. This is very important for us because it is a mechanism that will allow us to start women's reparations, because the government has not taken this into account. And this is a good opportunity to place sexual violence at the center of this ceremony and talk about possible rehabilitation and talk about what are the commitments on preventing this violence in the future. women's activists that are a very important part of this. So the gender dimension needs to be present and active. I know. Thank you, Mama Koité, for us. This is an excellent summary. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being with here today. And I'm going to switch over into English. Yes, Mama Koité has thanked everybody as well.
Thank you again, everyone, for coming, for listening. Thank you, Mama Koité. Thank you, Viviana. Thank you, Elisabeth, all of you for being part of this discussion. I certainly really enjoyed it. I hope everyone did. And it seems to me, that to just put a cap on it, a well-run reparations program should really be at the center of a women, peace, and security agenda, because it's where the pillars of women's participation and decision making, and also prevention and protection against SGBV can really intersect, and hopefully make a difference in preventing recurrence of violence in the future. And so, before they cut the line, let me just say happy CSW month, CSW, remainder thereof to everybody. And it was really great to see everyone. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you again to NORAD for their support.